The World Bank forecasts a 5.2% drop in global GDP and outlines goals to prevent this from happening. But with economic activity still badly disrupted, what can most countries really do? And as the U.S.-China trade war becomes a broader struggle, China's State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi calls for a return to cooperation. What does the standoff mean for the rest of the world, and what happens next? To talk about all this, I'm joined by James Early, CEO of Stansberry China, and by Jimmy Zhu, Chief Strategist at Fullerton Research. Welcome, gentlemen. First of all, I want to show you this. Let's take a look at this graphic. China and the United States now account for over 1/3 of global economic output and over 50% of global growth. Bilateral trade volume has increased by over 250 times since the early days of the diplomatic relations, and now it takes up 1/5 of the global total. Two-way investment has jumped from almost zero to nearly $240 billion, and two-way visits by the two peoples have reached 5 million. Now, Jimmy, let me go to you first. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi recently, actually it was yesterday, interviewed by Xinhua News Agency, where he struck a pretty conciliatory tone, talked about the importance of cooperation, rejected the notion that U.S.-China engagement has failed. What message is China sending to the United States?
Well, I think at this moment, I think the China message is definitely clear that, amid this pandemic, the business are really very slowing down, and probably the escalation between the two countries regarding the business or other areas, it might not be a good thing actually for everyone in the regions. So when I talk to a few companies here, I think some of them even raise the concern that the U.S.-China tensions probably is even more challenging when it becomes to do the business, even compared to the pandemic here. So I think for the both countries, I think it's very important for them probably at this moment need to calm down a little bit and just continue to carry on the business as usual. I think that's the best way to counter the side effect from the pandemic.
Well, James, what do you think? I mean, what's your takeaway from State Councilor Wang Yi's speech? Do you think anyone in Washington is listening right now?
Well, and good to see Jimmy again, by the way. As someone who does business between China and the U.S., I want to cry when I hear all those stats like you mentioned and think about that blowing up, right? I mean, there's huge trade. In a normal year, China buys $100 and something billion from the U.S., and the U.S. buys $500 something billion from China. That's a pretty happy marriage as far as I'm concerned. I think in general the theme we've seen is that the bark has been worse than the bite as far as the political rhetoric. I mean, both countries know that each one is the center of the world, so to speak, and the leaders tend to cater to that in their speech. But the economy, the business, the trade, both leaders have been more reluctant to damage that. So hopefully, although this is an election year from the U.S., things can cool down, and I'm inspired when I see both sides respond accordingly.
Right. A latest piece of development coming from both capitals is that, actually coming from the U.S. media reports, is that there are reports saying that the two sides might be meeting, initiating a high-level economic and trade dialogue headed by Vice Premier Liu He from China and also Secretary Mnuchin in the U.S. side. Reports that there can be a video call in mid-August to review progress of the Phase 1 trade deal. Jimmy, how hopeful should we be about this upcoming talk if it materializes?
Since March 2018, this kind of thing is always very difficult to predict. There's two things to highlight here is, if we look at the market reactions to global stocks, especially for the U.S. stocks, it seems like the U.S.-China trade tension news is not really affecting the market. Probably everyone is confused about that. Probably I think in my best guess is we will always think that the two countries has been cooperating for each other for so many decades. It's also not easy to decouple at this moment so easily. So, and a lot of, one of the major difference compared with last year is for this year, I see lots of tension is just based on the verbal, or probably it has a very direct limited impact on the economy. So at this moment, I see that the two sides probably will reach some certain agreement probably before, or even after the elections. I don't really believe the two countries actually will have some structural change in the near term.
Well, James, what do you think? Do you think officials from the Trump administration would still be in the mood for talks, and what could be some of their demands, going forward?
Well, first of all, thank God for Zoom these days. I mean, if they can have this meeting, that'll be fantastic. I mean, look, we're going into an election season right now in the U.S. Excuse me, and obviously, one of the strategies or just motifs has been sort of this blame China, and it's not just the U.S. I mean, you have the whole world or much of the free world, Canada, Japan, India, Australia, UK, Western Europe, decoupling from China in some way. So it's not just the U.S., but it is particularly the U.S. in this election year. But I think securing some type of second trade deal, which basically everybody has given up hope on, if something like that can happen, if there's a pause. I mean, Trump is, say what you will about him, but he's a pragmatist, especially about economic issues. And if we can get some kind of win there, if Trump can get some kind of win there, I think that would spell much smoother relations, and I certainly hope for that.
Let's talk about COVID-19 pandemic. According to the U.S. side, they will not have a vaccine, likely, before 2021. Until that happens, how should countries and the policymakers really cope with this reality? Striking a balance between reopening their economy and ensure that there's enough growth for jobs, for social stability. Jimmy, let me go to you.
Well, it's a very difficult balance. In the beginning, people think, okay, it's a half-half, but what we look at is once you need to open the business, especially the restaurant, the bars, it's very easy to transit. Even if I remember correctly, like the U.S. reopened the economy in June, but it seems like the cases are increasing again. But not like Europe. They sacrificed a lot to lock down the economy, but it seems like now they are easy to the pandemic, it seems the situation is a bit eased. So I think before the vaccine out finally, I mean, I hope it's not, but it seems like it's very difficult to balance the two. So sometimes the policymakers need to be a bit prudent or a bit flexible when dealing with such thing.
James, if a reliable vaccine is not available by the end of the year or, or early next year even, how should countries cope with the economic fallout?
Well, I agree with Jimmy. I mean, you have to have a medical solution before you have an economic solution. There's no way around that. So if we can't get the medical situation fixed, we being anybody in this world, we're not going to move forward economically. I mean, what's saving the U.S. after, frankly, a dismal performance has been a de facto herd immunity, meaning if you look at the South, Florida, Arizona, Texas, they had their virus cases spike high. Now the infection rate is falling quickly simply because so many people have it, and there's sort of a de facto herd immunity reached. So if there's not a vaccine, if there's not some cure or treatment, it's going to have to be something like that, unless everybody can just go back and do another lockdown the right way, but that's going to be politically unpopular.
Jimmy, the World Bank talked about slowing growth. We all saw that forecast. The World Bank also suggested countries and policymakers to mitigate the impact on health and, talked about economic consequences to protect the vulnerable group, the poor. But, with the global economy still shrinking, how can these goals be done?
I think the growth is mainly need to be from the domestic side, from different countries. Doing the trades among the different countries is not so easy at this moment. So there's two sides. When it comes to monetary stimulus, I think most of the major countries has done already they can do, like U.S., like Europe, or like Japan. Their interest rate already at zero, and they have already lots of liquidity. There's not much thing they can do. But on the other hand, especially what we see the progress from Europe, I think the fiscal stimulus, especially from the infrastructure projects, or even for some countries can lower their tax. I think that's the best way to spur the domestic demand at this moment. I think that's probably it's the best way to improve the global growth as a whole for this moment as a solutions.
James, with COVID-19 apparently halted commerce, halted trade, travel between people and amongst countries. What kind of adjustments globalization will have to face going forward? Do you think there will be an end to the globalization as we know it as countries emerge from COVID-19?
Well, look, we'll definitely have less of it, and that's just a bummer. As a simple example, I was looking at my iPhone, and imagining if everybody had to make their own iPhone, it would just be so inefficient, right? I mean, globalization brings us great benefits, but to switch analogies, I was at the beach years ago, and I saw these little crabs, and they were very timid, and as soon as they got scared, they'd go into their hole, but then gradually they'd come back out again. And I think we'll see the same thing with nations, meaning we're deglobalizing, period. That's happening, but it's not going to be complete, and it's only going to probably be a less than 10-year cycle, which is short in terms of humanity, and I think then things will start to move again, but it's going to be a painful 10 years, and I think it's going to teach us how precious that trade and that globalization really is, because maybe we don't value it enough right now.
Jimmy, what do you think? Is this just a blip on the radar, or will we have to come to terms with such a thing as deglobalization?
Well, I think at this moment there's not too much choice. Seems a lot of supply chain is a lot, but for the longer term, I think the globalizations is still provide lots of advantage to the economy, because the different economy got the different products or services they can provide. Some like say iPhone or other phones, they have to produce in some certain countries, and for some services they have to be went through some certain countries, and also the different education and professional background. So I think hopefully after this pandemic, of course, I think the globalizations probably will be a bit hurt at this moment, but for longer term perspective, I still believe that it will carry on.
Thank you very much to both of my guests tonight, James Early and Jimmy Zhu. Thank you both.